Welcome back to New York's Business Podcast. My name is Jacob Restituto. I am the host and owner of Restituto Media, a full-time, full-service photo and video company here on Long Island. Today I'm here with Paul Zweben, a serial entrepreneur. Quite the incredible story. So I appreciate you, Paul. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
Here and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me too.
So for people that aren't super familiar with you and your story, I'd love for you just to kind of explain who you are, introduce yourself, and go into the backstory of your serial entrepreneur story. So
we'll start in 1979. So 1979, I was taking home ec in junior high school, and we had a career study program, and I chose photography and cooking, because both of which I loved. I got an apprenticeship in a bakery in New Jersey for 4 years, went to the Culinary Institute of America, then I went to Florida International University for my bachelor's, which really helped me learn about not just looking at food as food, but looking at food as, can you make money on it? Once I finished that, I went to Morristown, New Jersey, started cooking. So I was there for about 2 years, and then it was time to come into the city. There was a professor at Florida International University that gave me a phone number to a guy to call when I was ready to go into New York. His name was Mark Sarrazin, and he ran a meat purveyor company, and now his son does, called DeBragger and Spiller. So I walked into his office. I was dressed in, a cheap suit, and he looks at me in his French accent, and he goes, "Who have you worked for? What chefs?" I said, "Well, I worked for, a chef at the Breakers Hotel during my internship." He's like, "Paul, I asked you a question. Who did you work for?" And I said, "Well, I worked for the executive chef at the Grand Bay Hotel in Coconut Grove." He's like, "Paul, I asked you a question. Who have you worked for?" And the answer is, you haven't worked for anyone. And he dismantled my 10-year career within about 35 seconds. And he basically took out a piece of paper. He called the River Cafe. He picked up, David Burke was the chef. He says, "David, I have a kid for you. He's gonna come over and meet you right now. Maybe you'll hire him." And I shook his hand. He told me how to get to the River Cafe. I was coated in sweat because he just broke me. And it was probably the best career opportunity that ever happened by him doing that for me. So I went to the River Cafe, and David hired me, $8.75 an hour. If I could have done it for free, I would have. It was like going to Wharton Business School to be a chef. Every single person that I worked with next to me, whether it was in pastry or the hot apps or fish or meat, they all became very, very big chefs all across the country. That brought me to 1991, and it was time for me to move on and become an executive chef, because I had been a sous chef for David for about 2.5 years. So I got a job at a restaurant called Chelsea Central, which was on 10th Avenue, 23rd Street. I got a 2-star review from the New York Times. Brian Miller, who I think is the best food writer ever at the New York Times. You would read his reviews and you felt like you were in the restaurant eating the meal with him. And then it was time to partner with other people, because you can't make a ton of money or be super successful with one restaurant. Some can, but not many. So I partnered up with 3 other guys, and we subsequently opened about 10 restaurants in New York City. Rain East, Rain West, Django, Union Pacific, Calle Ocho, Barbau, BLT Prime, BLT Steak, DC, and a couple other consulting gigs. And when we opened up DC, I was working there 6 days a week, living in a hotel, and then flying back to see my wife on a Sunday for 3 hours, and I'd be asleep by 7 o'clock. And one Sunday I checked out of the hotel, and then I checked back into the hotel the following day. And the woman behind the counter was like, "You just checked out yesterday, and something happened." And I was like, "I can't serve food anymore." So I called my wife, who at that point was a real estate agent for 6 years, and I said, "Honey, I just can't do this anymore. It's a young man and young woman's sport." And
what year was this?
This was 2007. And I was like, "I can't do this anymore." And she was like, "You've been buying and selling real estate since you're in your 20s. You listen to every one of my deals. Why don't you be my business partner?" Now, I was a restaurant person for life. I was a lifer. And the next day I walked in and sat down with my partners and said, "I'm leaving." And they all started to laugh. They were like, "What do you mean you're leaving?" And I was like, "It's time." And for the first, so I basically had about a year transition where I was in the restaurants and doing real estate. And that first year, we did a lot of socializing, and we still do. My wife said to me, "You know nothing about real estate, nothing. So every time we go out, I want you to talk about food." And she was right. You know, in New York City, people talk about dogs, babies, food, and real estate. Like, those are the 4 categories. And that was it. And I just started talking about food, and then I started to learn the craft. And that was 18 years ago, and which brings me here.
So many interesting things to talk about in that in your opening statements, I guess you could say. But one of the things I want to bring it back to one thing you said at the very beginning, and I think it kind of, for the first part of your career in the food industry, is kind of the foundation, where you said you went to Florida
International University,
where you learned that how to make money from food, essentially, or can food make money? I want to hear just a couple minutes or something like that about that, and what you learned, and why you think some businesses, some restaurants particularly, or some businesses in general, are successful with that and some aren't, because that's just an interesting statement.
Sure.
And I'd love for you to expand on that.
Sure. I didn't necessarily learn it in school, but as we started opening restaurants, so we had 2 Thai restaurants, and in Thai food, there's a lot of sugar that's used. If I bought, let's say the cooks needed 20 pounds of sugar per day to make the dishes. If I bought a 100-pound bag, they'd use 50 pounds a day. So my whole thing with food cost was always to buy as little as possible of everything. Otherwise, the cooks just waste it. No matter if they have a recipe book that's right next to them, they're just gonna waste it. So the tighter you make the amount of food that they can work with, the more efficient they are. So that's the first one. And then,
so just to comment on
sure.
that, so that's interesting, because it probably cost you more to buy smaller amounts instead of buying in bulk, but it actually saved you money in the long run, because it wasn't going to waste. That is, so one of the things I love about this podcast, and I hope that it comes across to the audience, is that you could be in any industry, and I hope that they take away things from this podcast.
Of course.
And that's just a really interesting business concept in general, because so many people, including myself, are like, oh, you know, let's purchase in bulk, whether you're buying anything, right? Camera equipment, this, that, but you know, any industry, right? But sometimes it can actually bite you in the butt. One, for opportunity cost, because it's upfront money going out the window, right? You can use that for something else. Or 2, because it might just be going to waste, which is really, really interesting.
Right. Well, I've talked about this next part many, many times. So let's say you have a butcher cutting filet mignon, and you get 5 or 6 filet mignons out of each loin. And when the restaurant is super busy, they may be cutting those supposed to be 12-ounce fillets at 13 or 14 ounces, right? So every loin, you're losing 1 portion. Now the restaurant gets slow, and you're like, oh my God, you start watching things tighter, and you're like, this guy's been wasting, you know, a portion of filet mignon every single tenderloin that he was doing or she was doing. So it's about watching, you know, randomly checking weights on everything. And it's super, super important. And then the other thing, what I've always been a huge proponent about, especially when I design menus, was people, first of all, don't need 30 appetizers and 30 entrees. They get overwhelmed. They probably look at the first 5 apps and 5 entrees, and they make a decision. The less items you have on the menu, the more efficient you're gonna be with food. The cooks are gonna be more efficient, and hopefully your profitability will be better.
Would you say, based on that as well, that you think you would sell more appetizers because it's less of the paralysis by analysis? You're not looking, the consumer or the customer is not looking at 30 different things and be like, I don't know what to get, I'm gonna get nothing? Or do you think that that's unrelated?
I think people get overwhelmed. So yes, I think people would potentially order an appetizer and an entree with the smaller menu.
Now piggybacking on top of that, you said that you at one time owned 10 restaurants, or co-owned 10 restaurants. So I would love to talk about that, because in the quote you said that it's very rare that an entrepreneur can be very successful financially in just one restaurant. It's possible, but it's very rare, you said. I'd love to talk and hear about the profitability of a restaurant, what you think makes it profitable, what doesn't make it profitable, but also then how you then carry that into a second and a
Sure.
third and what that looks like.
Okay. The number one important thing about a restaurant, well, there are two. Location, and your lease. If you sign a bad lease, you're already under the gun. So if you're signing a lease that is 150 or 200 bucks a square foot, and there's a 3% escalation every year, that 150 to 200 bucks a square foot is going to jump to $300 a square foot very quickly, because those 2 or 3% escalations compound. So it's your lease, it is your location, and then another thing that's extremely important is that every single lease should have something called a good guy clause. And what a good guy clause is, let's say you and I open a restaurant and we're like, it's gonna go under. And you're like, Paul, but we have 7 more years on the lease and we're gonna have to pay the monthly rent, whether there's a tenant or not. The good guy clause basically allows you to walk in, take the keys, put them on the counter, walk out, you're leaving all of your equipment and everything, your furniture and fixtures, and whatever back rent, you're personally guaranteed to having to pay that, but you don't have to pay anything forward. So the good guy clause is massively important.
What I find most interesting about what you just said is the profitability in a restaurant has nothing to do with the staff or the food. You mentioned all real estate thing. Of course it does,
yeah.
But the most important things that you just said from a guy that had 10 restaurants in New York and also in DC, that is really a real estate. It's actually more of a business mind than it is actually even a food related mind, which I find really interesting.
But food cost, labor cost, everything is important.
Sure.
And it's the same thing. It's like when you're buying toilet paper. If you're buying in bulk toilet paper, I remember my wife and I went out to dinner years ago and we're sitting at the bar at Quality Italian restaurant, and a waitress walks up to me and she's sort of flirtatious, and I'm just like, why is she doing this? Period. And my wife's like, who is that? I'm like, I don't know who it is. And she comes back, she goes, you don't remember me? And I said, I don't. She goes, you fired me at one of your restaurants because I stole 12 rolls of toilet paper. And I was just like, okay. But it's like, if there's extra stuff, people are like, nobody's gonna notice it. I'll throw it in my backpack. I'll put it in my pocket. So another reason is pilferage. You have to, with both customers and employees.
What is that word?
Pilferage, so stealing. At Calle Ocho, which was a Latin restaurant that we owned, we had a vessel called a cataplana. And a cataplana is it looks like a bowl, and then there's another bowl that folds over and you clip it. So one day, these 2 women came into the restaurant, thin, lovely, sat down, started eating, started talking, and they were there for like 90 minutes, and then they were leaving. And as both of them were leaving, I was like, that woman looks pregnant, and she was not pregnant when she got here. So I walked up to her and I said, I'm sorry, but you weren't pregnant when you got here. What do you have under your shirt? And she pulled out a cataplana, and she was stealing it. So there's many, many facets you have to control in the restaurant, and then you have to be busy.
Again, I find that really interesting because it kind of is counterintuitive to the things of, again, like just typical practices you would think, buying it in excess, buying in large, but there's also a lot of downsides to that. And those downsides really add up. Yep. I want to transition now into talking about one more thing you mentioned in your backstory is when you first got into real estate, your wife said, don't talk real estate, talk food.
Yes.
I think that is a really profound statement from your wife, because you talk about what you know, and when people know something specific and when people are confident in that, it creates a really nice conversation. And I'd love to just hear your experience with that and how you think people were receptive and how you used your expertise in a different industry to succeed in a new industry. Okay.
So one of my taglines now that I've been using a lot is, if I do a food video, whether it's in a listing that we have or our house, or I'm just walking on the street and I give a tip, at the end I say, if you think I know a lot about food, wait until you talk to me about real estate. So that's a hook. And then, like yesterday was my son's hockey practice in Long Island City, and I was talking to 3 moms while the kids were playing, and one of them said, tell me the best place I can eat pizza in Tribeca, what's a great restaurant in Flatiron, and have you ever been to Rayo's up in Harlem? And the answer was Lucia for pizza, Masara for incredible food on Broadway, and yes, I've been to Rayo's 100 times. So it's just about being knowledgeable, because what you really want to do in real estate or in any sales position, you want to be the go-to person. Hey, I need a baby nurse. Here's the person to talk to. Hey, where's the best place to get a drink in Grand Central Station? The Campbell apartment. You know, what's the best way to get from 14th Street, Union Square to Upper East Side in 7 minutes? You take the Express 4 or 5. So the more knowledge that we have and the more connections that we can make for people, that just becomes, you're like giving customer service. And eventually what you're hoping is they're going to work with you to buy, sell, rent, or invest.
So I've heard it said, now relating it to social media, because I feel like this is exactly, you're the in-person version of what I've heard social media can be, in the sense that I've heard 2 different schools of thoughts with social media, that you are super niche, and you go down that rabbit hole and like you relate to that specific niche like no other. The alternative is you have your industry, but you share a lot about yourself and just post random stuff.
Yes.
And the benefit to that is you connect to people in so many different ways.
Yes.
For example, if you're a Jets fan, I might not be hiring you because I think you're the best in the real estate industry. I might be hiring you subconsciously because, 1, I think you're qualified, but mainly because you don't hire anybody if you think they're qualified. But 2, mainly because, oh, he's a Jets fan, and subconsciously I like that about him, and he must be a really cool guy otherwise. You know? Or, oh, he's been to Rayo's 100 times. I got engaged at Rayo's. You know what I mean? It's just these little details that like the humanity kicks in. It's like, oh, I have 4 different real estate agents. Who am I going to pick? Well, this guy seems really cool because he's been to Rayo's. He knows a lot about New York City in general because he told me how to get to 14th Street. And he is a Jets fan, right? Hypothetically, right? Now, I've heard that in terms of social media, and I think that it really works when done properly. But it's the same thing that you're essentially building connection points.
Correct.
People then think of you, and start to trust you.
Right. And our social media is not just focused on real estate. For example, I'm sure you know this, but there was a huge NBA trade over the weekend. Huge. And I basically made the NBA explanation into a food analogy. And I said, the Lakers got a prime rib dinner with a pound of caviar and 4 bottles of 1972 Dom Perignon. Dallas got a crudité. That's it. Like, that's all I have to say. Yeah. And like 20 people texted me yesterday and were like, that totally makes sense. So again, a lot of things I do, like I try to give analogies with food into real estate, but I'm all over the place. Like I can be, talking about a converted church, like where we're sitting, or, talking about Dumbo and what the guy that first started buying buildings in Dumbo paid per square foot, which was $7. Wow.
I'd like to talk about transition of industry, and for somebody that might be listening to this, it might be in a similar position where it's like, I've been really highly successful in what I'm doing, but I want to do something different. I want to hear about the conversation that you had with your partners and how that went, and also even just the transition of power of like, okay, I have 10 restaurants. How do I get out of these 10 restaurants into something new? Right.
So the conversation was very easy. Hey guys, I'm going to work with my wife and sell real estate. One of the partners pulled me aside and he was like, I think you should give us some equity in your partnership with your wife. And I was like, Stephen, that's not happening. But it was a very, they understood. We had been together for a long time, for like 15 years. And we just talked about the transition and like the hours that I would work, over the first year and how I would eventually exit. And then I feel that it's so incredibly important. The majority of us did not sell real estate or grow vegetables or whatever at 18 years old. And, let's say you met me and I had worked on Wall Street in the 80s and 90s. I would talk about that all the time if I was getting into a different business. All the time. The war stories, there's probably thousands of war stories when, on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can take those stories and translate them into what you're doing now, people understand that.
Yeah.
People love listening to stories about crazy things that happened, in kitchens. I mean, my wife was a cocktail waitress for me at one of my restaurants. I wanted to go out with her. I got her phone number from the payroll sheet. Okay, that's not allowable anymore, right? But but those, and people love that. They're like, man, that was cool. Like, so it's like you're connecting with people.
Yeah. So 10 restaurants is a lot, and I want to hear, is that like a new business every time it opens up? Is that just like an extra leg onto a business? Talk to me about, one, how you decide, hey, it's time to open up a new restaurant, how you decide if you're actually ready to open up a new restaurant, and what that looks like. Because a lot of businesses and a lot of restaurants, but a lot of businesses struggle when they try to expand. They say,
Right.
okay, whether it be a restaurant, and they say, okay, we want a new location, or in your case, a lot of it was just totally different restaurants.
Yep.
You mentioned several different types of restaurants. So like, what makes you say, I want to open up a Spanish restaurant when I have a steakhouse, right?
Right.
Or is it acquisition of a,
I mean, so our first restaurant that we had was called Main Street. It was American family style. Have you been to Carmine's in the city? Basically that, but American. So whole roast chicken, all the mashed potatoes you could eat, giant chicken parmesan, and we made a lot of mistakes there.
Pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, it was a great concept, but we just made a ton of mistakes. And there was another restaurant around the corner, and it was going under. And one of my partners really wanted to open a Thai restaurant, and I was like, we don't know anything about Thai food. He's like, we'll figure it out. And we basically made a deal with the owners of the lease at the restaurant around the corner, and we went and eventually bought it. I went to Asia for a month and cooked in Thailand, Bangkok, and Hong Kong. I worked in a bunch of different hotels. I ate street food every day. It was one of the best 30 days of my life because it was life-changing. But it was really about the real estate. So when we found, a property that made sense, we jumped on it. Union Pacific, which was critically acclaimed, was not a huge moneymaker. This was like in the late 90s, but we had a great lease. So my partner Steve was golfing with the owner of the BLT group, and they started talking, and they were like, why don't we open a BLT Prime in that space, because Union Pacific is no longer working. We have this great lease. Let's do a new partnership. Boom.
It also sounds through your conversation that so much of this is through relationship.
Yes.
It all originally started back with the guy with the three different Rolodexes,
Yep.
and the meat industry, and now even with the BLT group you're mentioning. Can you speak to the importance of relationship and how you actively try to maintain or grow new relationships?
Yes, relationships are everything. They're everything. And, it's like I went to a convention in Charleston a couple months ago for Compass agents. And you have people that just walk up to you and hand you their card, and they're like, let's do business, and then they walk away. I'm never doing business with that person. Like, I want to know about that person. And, what I've been doing lately about building relationships is I've invited different agents from Connecticut, from Jersey, from Long Island. They come to my office. We, talk about our lives, our children. Do we have children, grandchildren? What is their, where do they target? What is their target market? What's going on in their market? And then I look at them, I'm like, let's do a Q&A. And you'll ask me 5 questions, and I'll ask you 5 questions. There'll be 2 1-minute Instagram videos. But what you're doing is, like, those relationships, and then I start to dig into those. I remind myself to call, Diana every 4 months and talk to her about what's going on in the first quarter or the second quarter of 2025, in the New York City market. So it's really about developing the relationships and then digging deeper into those relationships. But they're everything. Relationships are everything.
You've been doing real estate for 18 years at this point. Do you see yourself continuing in real estate? Do you see yourself starting anything new?
I definitely see myself continuing for many, many more years. The only thing that has changed a little bit in sort of our growth and strategy is we want to build our team to be a bigger team. And then before we went on camera, I talked to you about these property/food videos. And they're really, I think I'm about to do my 4th one in Charleston in a couple weeks, where I go to Charleston, we do a quick tour of the house or townhouse, and we end up in the kitchen, and then me and or the listing agent or just me makes a dish. And it brings a lot of things together. It shows community. It shows that, New York is connected to Charleston or wherever. And the hook for that particular video is my client can go to the Hamptons and buy a property, or they can buy a property in Charleston for $600 a square foot, which is very, very low, and fly there and do a one-way in 2 hours and 20 minutes between the cab, the airplane, and the cab again. So that's the hook.
You really you got things going, man. It's exciting to hear and exciting to see, because you're utilizing, from a business perspective, and again, I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs, I've talked to a lot of business owners. It's cool to see when somebody's utilizing all different aspects of whether it be social media, including, I think that a lot of people disconnect too when they go from industry to industry, and they say, okay, that was my first part of my life, and I'm now in this new season. Right. But now you're connecting it all and threading it all together, and I think that's brilliant.
Thank you.
I love to hear that.
Yeah, you got it. I mean, you have to, and it's like, the amount of chefs that I know out here in the Hamptons, in New York City, they all know that I sell real estate now. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had about a year ago, Bobby Flay's business partner, and they've been business partners since day one, sends me a text. I hadn't talked to him in like 6 years, and he said, I get your newsletter every single month for the last 10 years. My sister needs to sell her apartment. We're not interviewing anyone else. Can you meet me at my sister's apartment tomorrow at 3 o'clock? It's about relationships.
100%.
And consistency in marketing.
Sure, consistency is super important. Mm-hmm. But do you work in just residential, or do you do commercial as well?
So commercial, I refer to other people. It's a completely different animal, and when I first started, I thought I would be able to help people lease out restaurant spaces, and it's just a different animal, and I was like, I don't want to be part of this.
Sure. So the last question I want to ask you is, again, from that transition of industry, what do you think you learned in your restaurateur industry that you're bringing into the real estate? What whether it be tips or this or that, whatever the case may be, like, are there things that you've been like, this is super applicable, or this I think we could do differently, whatever the case may be? Food
goes bad, real estate goes bad. If you're not responsive on either businesses, you're fired. If you don't know what you're talking about, you're fired. And then customer service. When we had restaurants, if you had somebody leaving that was pissed off because it wasn't a good experience, they're going to tell 500 people. If a customer leaves and they had a great experience, they're going to tell 12 people. We would do whatever we had to do to prevent them from walking out the door pissed. Whether it was buying them drinks, whether it was sending out extra food, whether it was buying their dinner. We did whatever we had to do to make sure that they were happy when they left.
I just had a conversation in another one of these interviews, similar to this, totally different industry, but we were talking about the same exact thing, and it blows my mind, I don't know what it'd be, like the stubbornness or the audacity of the business owner in any industry when they refuse to try to accommodate the customer and be like, screw them, we don't need them.
Right, and they do.
The cost of one meal, even in the whole table, right? $300, say, right, for 2 people, 3 people, whatever. That $300 is so much less than the 500 people that are never coming to the restaurant again.
100%.
And it's so short-minded that people are playing checkers instead of the actual chess game. It's just the bottom line of the $300, because now 10 people are never going to come to your restaurant ever again. That's several thousand.
1,000,000%.
It's, again, there's heated emotions and stuff. Sometimes in your emotions you forget to be rational. But like, if you can pull yourself back and be like, let's be rational about this. Let's try to actually, accommodate the customer. Even if you put your pride aside, right? It flabbergasts me sometimes when I'm like, what is this guy doing?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, even in my own experience, I go out somewhere, I'm like, I would have handled this so differently. And I don't think I'll ever come back here.
Right.
Because it was just, it could have been done so much better.
Right. Or
I hear a story and I'm like, I really liked that place, that business.
Right.
And now I hear a story of how they handled it with one of my friends or a coworker, and I'm like, that's really sad, because that really upsets me, and now I don't know if I want to support. Now there's the balance of grace, and maybe their mom just died, so right. But still, it's very interesting.
Right. But the bottom line is, whether they are right or not, the customer is always right. And sometimes you got to eat crow to make that customer happy, whether they're right or wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and
My pleasure.
Very interesting conversation. So for all the guests listening, thank you so much for listening. Go check out all the things that he's doing. And if you are a business owner or know any business owners that you might think would be a good fit for this podcast, send me a message and we'll chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.